Calling to order this meeting of the Cleveland Heights City Council's Housing and Building Committee at 1:03 p.m. on Tuesday, February 27th. Clerk Ballister, could you please call the roll?
Petrus.
Here.
Larson. Here. Maddox.
Here.
Also, we have Council President Kuda, Director Zamp, and Assistant Director Butler with us. So firstly, thank you everyone for taking time to sit down. Really appreciate it. I think that this is a great opportunity for us to try to get this legislation over the finish line. So firstly, I'd like to just sort of talk through the process that I hope that we could use during today's meeting. And then once I've overviewed that, I just want to give an overview of the different documents that the clerk collected and shared out. So firstly, I think that it would be good for us to go through each of the substantive differences between President Kuda's version and the mayor's proposal and allow each party to overview its position on that. Director Zamp, would you feel comfortable speaking on behalf of the mayor and the proposal that he made?
Well, staff has our comments on both proposals,
Okay.
so I feel like through that vehicle we can do that.
Okay, so as we go through those differences, if there is something that you have between, two that we go through, feel free to bring it up so that we could address it. And then just try to decide amongst ourselves how we want to proceed where there might be a difference of opinion. And if necessary, I think that the fairest way of thinking is an impasse on how we might, an impasse on any particular thing. I think the fairest approach would be for the committee members to vote on, how we want to proceed with it. And finally, because Council President Kuda's version is the one that was introduced, I think that we need to use that as the baseline version. So now before overviewing the different documents, are there any questions about that process that I just sort of talked through? Is that okay with everyone? Okay, so the clerk, like I said, pulled together several different documents and shared them out. So after the agenda in the packet is what Council President Kuda initially introduced. The second document in the packet is a red line document that I will come back to in a minute. The third document in the packet is the current version of Council President Kuda's legislation. And then the final document, the fourth and final document, is a proposal made by the mayor. So going back to the red line version.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, of course.
When you said proposal made by the mayor, do you mean subsequent to the latest version of this?
So during the committee of the whole meeting last week, he emailed me a proposal that he drafted. And so that is what I shared with the clerk and what she included in the packet.
Okay.
So it's my understanding that that's what he shared with folks last fall. And
okay, got it.
And he sent it to me, and then I sent it to the clerk so that she could include it. Now, of course.
Can I ask a further question?
Yeah.
Because I believe that, correct me if I'm wrong, the legislation that was before you last week was this synthesis of the original plus the mayor's?
Yes.
Okay, so the red line is just reflecting that. There was nothing new beyond.
And Addie, was the red line prepared by the law department?
Yes.
Okay.
Or sent it to me.
There's so many red lines.
Thank you for joining us. Really
Yes.
appreciate it. So now,
President,
yeah, of course.
Mr. Chair, when you're referring to the packet, can you please help me if you tell me which page of the packet we're on, if you can do that?
Yes, yeah. So
There's
just
so
to
many
run
versions.
through these documents again. So the original that Council President Kuda introduced is on page 2.
Okay.
And then the red line, which we'll go through here in a second, begins on page 6.
Okay,
And then the current version of Council President Kuda's legislation, which Director Zamp just noted, is a synthesis of what he initially introduced and what the mayor proposed, begins on page 21.
Okay.
And then finally, the mayor's drafted proposal begins on page 36.
thank you very much.
So back to this red line version. So just so that it took me a minute to get acquainted with it. So just to sort of explain for everyone how this document works. So if text is black, that means that it's in both the mayor's drafted proposal and in the current version of President Kuda's legislation. If something is red and crossed out, that means that it was included in the mayor's proposal, but not in the latest version, Council President Kuda's legislation. And if something is red and underlined, that means that it was not included in the mayor's proposal, but it is included in the latest version of Council President Kuda's legislation. So if we look at page 6 of the packet, that is the first page of this red line document, we can see that in the first paragraph, there is text that is red and crossed out. So what that means is that that was included in the mayor's proposal, but it is not included in the current version of Council President Kuda's legislation. So what we see on pages 6 and 7, which are the first 2 pages of this red line document, we see 2 different sets of whereas clauses. So first, we have a set that was proposed by the mayor, and they're crossed out. And then after that, we have a set of whereas documents that was included by Council President Kuda. So that's sort of an overview of how to read that document. Are there any questions? Lori, did I get that correct?
I'm not, that's what I was wondering. Did the mayor submit, we've been working with Councilman Kuda's document, and then we also worked with the Cincinnati document to propose something to the mayor. And then after, there's a blend of the two, I think, after Councilman Kuda's response to that. I'm not sure about what the last, what you referred to as number 4.
Yes, so at our last...
The mayor has a new proposal?
So at our committee of the whole meeting last week, the mayor emailed me a document that was dated from October. That he said that he shared. I can't remember the specifics, but my general understanding was that that was his drafted proposal.
I think that was.
And so this red line is comparing that document from the mayor with the current version of Council President Kuda's legislation.
And the current version of Councilman President Kuda's version, to my knowledge, includes the mayor's comments. It's the meld of the two.
Right. So when you look at this red line document, there is a lot of commonality.
Yep.
There are very few areas where there are differences. And so I think that that is really great for us, that we're starting in a really good place. So, hopefully we'll be able to get through all this, plus anything else that anyone identifies as, a topic for discussion. So with that, yep.
Can I just give a preface to what our comments are going to be as we go through this?
Yeah, sure.
So we the staff, and it is Alan, myself, our chief housing inspector, Noor Messina, and Karen Knittel, our assistant director of zoning, looked at this through the lens of what's the problem we're trying to solve, and what are we seeing as the people who are dealing with this on an everyday basis, and then how would we implement it? So you'll see we have a lot of comments that are sort of procedure-based, but some also higher-level policy-based comments. So I just wanted to sort of set the table where we were coming from.
Is it okay to assume that the mayor is on board with ideas that you shared today? Or will we need to circle back with him and say, hey, the staff suggested these things?
I'm assuming he's on board, although I guess we'll see as we go through it, because again, it's sort of questioning maybe some of the purpose of what we're trying to do, or at least trying to get on the same page about that.
Well, for instance, comment G3, why are we singling out short-term rentals? I mean,
I'm sorry, where's G3?
Well, this wasn't shared with you. This is
those
our
are
comments on the red line, which
Okay.
I guess the point is,
we just did it.
don't assume that the mayor agrees with all his staff comments. I mean, it's something that Council President Kuda, excuse me, has been working on, and the mayor asked us to draft something, which we did based on a Cincinnati ordinance, which you also use, but I don't know that if you're, like the existence of, why are we doing this? That's a big question for council that I don't know if the mayor agrees with staff or if staff has an opinion on it.
And if I could just add, a lot of what you'll see our comments is that we already have a process, a local process for rental registration. This is taking another process, likely from Cincinnati, where maybe they don't have a rental registration or the same type of rental registration. So there's a lot of conflict between what we're already doing and what this process is. So if we do decide to go down this path, we'll have two processes that are vastly different from each other, and that will have a tremendous impact on our ability to actually do that work.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it makes sense that where possible, we're able to mold the current legislation to current processes so that we're not forcing you to, create a separate set of processes just for this piece of legislation. Do you by chance have specific suggestions for things that we might be, okay?
Yeah,
And
line by line.
Okay, awesome. And just to sort of get a sense of the volume of comments about how many, and I'm sure that you'll send like the document after the fact, but just since we're at the start of the conversation, about how many
Let's see how
comments do you think that there might be?
So this was,
Sort of leafing through, I think that it was initially 14 pages, the draft.
Let's look at the last
So is it
comment.
maybe a couple of comments per page?
Yeah. There's 36 comments.
In total, so,
regards
okay, maybe 2 or
short-term
3 per
rental.
page.
No, it's longer. But planning did not address the excise tax,
Okay, so I guess
maybe about 40.
if it's okay, let's start to go through with the substantive differences that we have in the red line version that was included in the packet. And like I said, we'll talk through those differences, try to reach consensus. The clerk will take notes. And then where you notice that there's something else, so for example, on the second page of the red line document, there's about another page before another red line section. So if you, for example, in the middle of there, know that there's something that you want to bring up, just feel free to bring it up and then we could address it then. The clerk will take note of it. We could try to reach consensus on whatever it is and then, fold it into an amended version or create an amended version.
Mr. Chair, do you want me to speak to the purpose? Because, you seem to want to start there, the whole purpose of this.
Yeah, if we,
I could, as the author, I think I should.
if we could limit that discussion to just a few minutes to sort of set like a foundation and then
It could
dive
be
into
1 minute as far as I'm concerned. So there were complaints, I'd say at least a couple dozen. I shared them with the committee mostly like the second half of last year. The problem that I felt needed to be taken on was people saying that that it was very disruptive to their neighborhoods, that in particular, sometimes there were buildings where some of the residents were there as long-term renters, if you will, and that people were coming and going on a daily or other daily basis at all hours of the night. There were parking problems, there were noise problems, and so forth. And again, neighbors not knowing who these people are. So when I started looking around, well, what other cities do? That's kind of like, next up. I looked at North Royalton, North Olmsted, Rocky River, Columbus, Cincinnati, probably 4 or 5 others that I'm not going to recall off the top of my head. And oddly enough, completely independent of each other, the mayor and I both gravitated towards the same legislation from Cincinnati. It was the most straightforward. It was, I think, the most comprehensive, and I believe it solved the problems by doing a few things. One is creating a time frame for when you could, defining what a short-term rental was, separating it out from long-term rentals by having the people fill out a form. So if the problems were ever to be identified, they wouldn't be mixed because I don't see the problems as always the same between what people complain about with short-term rentals and what they might complain about with long-term rentals. I would also say that I found that the vast majority of people who are in this business do follow the law, and you know, another one of the goals in this purpose was to kind of make, you know, leave them harmless, but make sure that if we needed to hold landlords accountable, that there was a way to do it. Right now, we with the present system is we don't even know who's doing short-term rentals here. Anyway, I mean, I could get into more detail, but I think that's the.
Any sort of comments or questions before we dive in?
No, I think we agree that short-term rentals do present a different problem or situation compared to longer-term rentals. It's just the proof will be the devil will be in the details about how we want to manage it. And I'll just add that I think what the technical staff can bring is, whereas these other communities may have very good ordinances, they also may deal with their longer-term rentals or their rental registration in a different way. So we just want to point that out to you as you consider this.
Just an overall response to that, and not disagreeing at all. Hotels are certainly regulated by state law and the state building code. Rentals, landlord-tenant relationships, which are defined as the 30 days or more, are also regulated by state law, heavily regulated, and give certain protections to tenants. Short-term rentals are not regulated by state law, so what we look at is there a rational basis for distinguishing between one and another. That doesn't mean you want to or you don't want to treat them the same, but there is a rational basis for distinguishing that based on the fact that there's no state regulation of short-term rentals, both for it's mostly for protection of the tenants, because I think the state law on long-term rentals, regular rentals, landlord-tenant law doesn't really protect the city per se. It's there to protect the landlords and the tenants from each other.
Okay, so let's go ahead and start at the beginning of the red line document. So the first major difference that I see are the whereas clauses. So in the mayor's version, there are 8 different whereas clauses, and in Councilman Kuda's, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and many of them are similar. But I noticed that the 6th and 8th clauses from the mayor's version are not included in Councilman Kuda's. So I guess, Tony, do you want to, or I'm sorry, Council President Kuda, would you like to just overview your thought there, or Director Zamp, do you happen to have any questions, or do you think that what Council President Kuda put together is sufficiently similar and you are okay with?
I mean, I just had looked at a lot of legislation and just used my own words and wrote them out after looking at the kind of gist of that, and then, you know, also taking into consideration the complaints and so forth. I kind of just synthesized that into the whereas clauses. That was probably the most wording I wrote in this particular thing, and then the rest of it was just, you know, what does this legislation do? And those were more bullet points. But so it wasn't through any objection. I had already written out, you know, whereas clauses that I thought got to the heart of the matter.
I think we the staff we're fine with Council President Kuda's version of it, because they are pretty much similar. But we have a comment on both versions on 2 of these, which just wanted to point out. So in the we'll call it the Council President Kuda version of it, the 3rd to last whereas, which is whereas on the other hand, the city has received complaints from neighbors, et cetera.
Yep.
We just wanted to point out, and maybe this is a little bit of wordsmithing, that we felt that this should be quantified, because while we've received complaints, not all of them are substantiated. In fact, probably the majority of them were not found to be. It doesn't mean that the complaints weren't legitimate in the first place, but I think from our point of view, it's not the number of complaints, it's the number of violations that is the important metric.
This is one of the issues I raised with the original original legislation in terms of tracking those complaints. What happened with them, where they're coming from, how many are there, and my concern was writing that out without having that data pooled to see exactly what's happening with these complaints, where they're coming from, because you can have 30 complaints from one person and they not be valid, but because they're complaints, we're writing legislation from it. So I think we need to delve further into that in terms of the data when we're writing out a whereas clause like that, because it leads people to believe that maybe there is a larger issue than there is based on what the data is describing. And so that was my original issue and why I wanted that removed. And I see that there is a similar wording in the other underlying version as well, as one of the whereas I'm still concerned about, but it is written a little bit better than the other version. I just don't want anyone with the impression that we are writing this because of an influx of complaints when we don't have the data to support that.
Yeah, as Councilman Maddox noted, there is a similar clause in the mayor's version. So maybe we could take a look at those. So in Council President Kuda's version, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th one. And in the mayor's version, it's the 4th one. So the mayor said, whereas on the other hand, the city has received complaints and heard disputes between neighbors and property owners who list their properties for short-term rental, as some renters have committed noise violations or otherwise failed to show civility and respect for the impacted neighborhood and its residents, such that the properties constitute a public nuisance and threaten the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens and residents of the city. That's what the mayor included in his version. And Council President Kuda says, whereas on the other hand, the city has received complaints from neighbors of short-term rental properties who have had to endure repeated noise violations, parking problems, and a lack of civility and respect for the impacted neighbors, such that at times these short-term rental properties have caused a public nuisance that has threatened the health, safety, quiet enjoyment, and welfare of the residents of the city.
So if I may, I have the emails, which I printed out. I had no idea whether any of these were resolved. That wasn't even the issue to me.
From the law department's point of view, the only thing we want to make sure is when we have something in the whereas specifically that's quantifiable, that we have data to support it. Because if we enact this, and somebody challenges us, the first thing we're going to do is, well, list all the complaints. And it's not that it's illegitimate to have the complaints that you may have gotten verbally. We just want to make sure what we say is accurate.
No, these were written complaints, and I did print them out. As a matter of fact, I put them up on the screen. The one thing I cannot do, there were some complaints that were verbal, and there were probably some that I don't remember that were verbal, and then there were some that in a word search like short-term rental, or Airbnb or something. Not everybody wrote something in those terms, so not everything was searchable, but I had probably 12 that I found. And then, but again, I understand the distinction between a complaint and something that was, I don't know the right word, followed up on and taken down as a violation and prosecuted or anything. That I do not know.
Right, to that matter, it may have even been a different department complaint. So there's certain issues in this inherently that may have been housing violations and or structure related versus noise complaints,
Right.
police matters, things like that. But yeah, to sort of quantify how many and what actually resulted in violation notices or citations being issued is somewhat it's not quantified.
Lori, if I could, so both versions say, quote, has received complaints. So am I hearing correctly that if we include that, we ought to quantify that in some sort of way?
My boss is here, I'll let him address it.
I don't think it needs to be quantified, but I think it ought to be, contextualized, and be sort of generally accurate and
Supported.
Yeah.
That we could show it.
So I guess
because, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but if you quantify them, very specifically, it's very possible it'll be a wrong number. It's also very possible that it's hard to determine what the exact precise number is.
Yep.
So I think, again, just making sure that it's essentially accurate and in context.
So from my perspective, they seem pretty similar. So Director Hanna, we are looking at the first and second pages of the red line version. So we are talking specifically on the first page about the fourth whereas clause, which was included in the mayor's version, but not included in Council President Kuda's version. And on the second page, about the fifth whereas clause, which was included in Council President Kuda's version, but not in the mayor's version. So they're very similar. And so I guess, do you have a preference regarding the language? Because they seem, from my perspective, although it's different language, they seem to be basically getting at very similar things there.
Yeah, I think that they're not, terribly different, as you said. And I think that on the first page, it was largely based on recitals that appeared in the City of Cincinnati short-term rental regulatory ordinance. And the fifth on the second page is, again, similar but slightly different as written up by the council president.
So are you pretty agnostic too?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some respects, the one on the first page is arguably a little more general.
Okay. Does that mean better?
I mean, maybe, yes. Lawyers love wiggle words
Okay.
and wiggle room. Yeah.
So I guess, Council President Kuda, would you be okay if we were to?
Absolutely.
Okay, so is that
Absolutely.
okay if we use the mayor's version on that one? Okay. And I think that also in Council President Kuda's version, there is a new whereas clause. So the third one listed there, the city does not currently differentiate its certificate of occupancy permitting for rentals of 30 days or more from rentals that are between 1 and 29 days. So that, again, was included in Council President Kuda's version, but not in the mayor's proposal. Director Zamp, is that okay with you?
Well, this legislation definitely does make that differentiation, so it's a true statement.
Okay. Okay, so you're okay with that being?
Yeah, the mayor's version did not make that distinction.
Okay.
I did have one
Yeah, of
other
course.
shared comment, which is and then I think it's almost identical language in both. Let's see which one this is. 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth one in the mayor's and the sixth one in Council President Kuda's, which is the city seeks to ensure that short-term rentals are meeting all city minimum standards, et cetera, et cetera. So just a comment on both of those, which is we seek to do that for all properties within the city. So it doesn't seem to be a whereas that adds any value because we do that. Now, if we're saying that we're providing additional standards via this ordinance, I think that's valid language, but we seek to do the minimum for every property.
So given that it's not adding any, so I guess we're acknowledging that it doesn't add anything, might there be a reason for us to remove it or? Director Hanna, do you
I
have
like
a
it.
preference? Okay, you like
And
including it?
part of the reason is that this short-term rental use, I mean, one of the reasons that the city is contemplating whether to do something about it is sort of an unusual, maybe not quite unique, but distinct use. It's different than a long-term rental. It's different than a non-rental property. It's different than a commercially operated, hotel. But it has some attributes that are quasi-commercial. You have potentially large numbers of people using these properties for short periods of time. So I don't think that the fact that it's technically true that our codes apply generally means that we can't include this to sort of explain why the city's looking at this to make sure these properties are being operated responsibly, essentially. And so if this is just a reminder to the operators and owners, even that's, and typically we don't spend a lot of time on the recitals. So I don't think it's, if it comes out, I'm not gonna lose any sleep over it. But I think that, to my eyes, it looks fine there.
Okay, and sorry, Eric.
And my thought was, we're trying to create parity here and between the two. And although what you say is true, the problem is when we don't know who's doing this business, the reasoning for doing it is you can only apply this if you know who's doing it. You can't apply it to people who are flying basically under the radar of what a short-term rental is. And I think that was my initial reason for putting it in there.
So Director Hannah, is it okay if we go with Council President Kuda's version, or do you have a preference for what the mayor drafted on in the 5th whereas clause on the first page?
I mean, I really don't care. This isn't personal. I like the style of the first one. But I do not care which one is used. I think they both accomplish the same thing.
The reason I like mine better is because it gives the information, the specific information about what a short-term rental is, but it's not a deal breaker because that does come later in the legislation.
Okay.
It does get defined.
So given that yours is already in there, Councilwoman Larson, Councilman Maddox, would you be okay with keeping that current one, or would you prefer to instead substitute the mayor's language? Is it okay?
I'm fine either way.
That's good.
Okay, so let's go ahead and keep Council President Kuda's.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, of
Can I
course.
ask a question? I don't understand the explanation, which is not to say I have any issue with it. Seeks to ensure that short-term rentals are meeting existing minimum standards. It's fine. But then the first one says, seeks to ensure that properties that are being rented out for short periods meet minimum standards. Again, I don't have a preference. I'm fine with the council president's language, but I just didn't understand the explanation of what was different.
You know what? I actually was reading
Okay.
one above.
That's fine.
Do you see what I'm saying?
I wondered about that, yeah. Okay.
So.
Okay,
Yeah.
so are we sticking with Council President Kuda's version? Is that still okay then? Okay, now, yes, of course. I'm sorry. Yep.
I wanted to react to what Council President said, which I think was a good point. What I don't see in these whereases is this sort of flying under the radar component. I know we're spending way too much time on the whereases, but that really is a big part of this. Is we want to create a mechanism through our codes to be able to identify and track these short-term rentals. So I think if we get that in there, then it really does explain why we're doing all these other things.
So am I hearing that you're proposing that we include another whereas clause that says that we're seeking to track those that are sort of flying under the radar?
I would agree. That was part of the reasoning.
Okay. Are we able, Director Hannah, able to request that the law department draft another whereas clause to include regarding this
Sure.
interest? Okay. So
We'll make a note of that.
I was gonna say, can somebody give us a note of what they want?
No, that's fine. We can try something.
Okay, thank you. So I noticed that there are two whereas clauses that were included in the mayor's that are not included in Council President Kuda. So if we look at this first page, that would be the 6th and 8th. The 6th and 8th clauses. So number 6 talks about raising revenue, whereas the city also seeks to raise revenue through taxation of short-term rentals. And then the 8th, which is the last one on the page, says starts with, whereas council also desires to ensure that an outside short-term rental industry, yada, yada, yada. So, yes.
Because we are talking about excise tax, this is for you, Director Hannah, later on in the document, it seems to me that it should be mentioned in a whereas clause as well.
I'm good with that, and I think that it was struck because initially that wasn't being contemplated by the council president, and then after some discussion and examination, the language adopting that chapter went back in, but the recitals weren't revisited.
That is true.
Okay, so would it be okay to re-add it?
Which one are we re-adding, sorry?
The sixth one on the
Okay.
first page. Okay, re-add, and then the final one on that page, the eighth whereas clause. Whereas council also desires to ensure that an outside short-term rental industry in the city of Cleveland Heights does not create a dearth of affordable housing and does not artificially lead to quickly increasing residential rent costs in the city. District.
Chair, yeah, we had a concern about this whereas clause in the mayor's version of it, so because we're not sure that this is inaccurate. Well, where's the data behind this statement?
So you would be okay with continuing with it not being included?
And so would I, but I would add that Councilor Larson and I have attended seminars where data was produced that basically said a couple of things. One is that the more short-term rentals you have, the higher rents go up because it creates a shortage of long-term rental property. I don't even know if that's the right term.
So I guess just for clarification, this was not included in your version.
Correct.
So it was included in the mayor's and then you did not include it in yours.
Correct.
So they were concerned about including it and to their delight, you did not include it. So I guess the question was, is it okay if we do not include it?
Okay. I mean, I was just giving you more than you wanted to hear.
No, that was supporting what you put together.
But I understand why the director is uncomfortable with it. And I'm fine with leaving that out.
Okay. So we
May I
were,
ask a quick?
yes, of course.
Just going back to the one about the taxation,
Yes.
that whereas clause does also include, it says short-term rentals and hotels. Are we leaving out, or should we leave out hotels since we're not talking about hotels?
It applies to hotel.
Okay, but I just didn't know if you wanted to, because I know there is a taxation on hotels, but this particular piece of legislation doesn't talk about hotels, is it?
We can revisit it, it does, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so
And I'm sorry.
yeah, go.
Just on that note, as you're moving forward, because I don't know what's the projected duration of this meeting?
2 hours.
Wowza. Okay.
And if we don't use all that time, get it back.
It does seem to me in looking at some materials this morning that the question of the excise tax maybe is something that you'll want to refer to the finance committee. Because I think that it's a part of this piece of legislation, but I think it is also a separate animal and it's somewhat new here. So that's just a thought in terms of working through these details.
So I'm sorry, so for clarification, am I hearing that, let's say that we work through all of these differences today, am I hearing that you're suggesting that it also go to the finance committee to further discuss that particular?
Yes.
Okay.
And along the lines of the first comment that you made, I don't know if there's been discussion yet, but there were some sort of late breaking comments on the ordinance overall that emanated out of the planning department. I mean, within the last 90 minutes or something. And I think a lot of them are very thoughtful and raise questions that based on the way the evolution of this ordinance, haven't been worked through yet. So I have no objection to, obviously, this committee can do what it wants to do, and I have no objection to working through the rest of the ordinance now and comparing the changes to the initial administration version versus the council president's version. But I do think, particularly after reviewing some of the newer comments, that there are a number of issues that ought to be worked through in order to make sure that this is a piece that's fully developed and appropriate for the city.
And Director Zamp, is Director Hanna referring to the comments that you've printed out? Okay, so yeah, so what we decided was that as we work through the comments that are in the red line, as they have additional commentary, they'll bring them up and then the committee could, figure out how to fold that in as necessary. So would that sufficiently address the comments?
Have they seen
That's what
Well, but that's what you're going to bring up, is that right?
Yeah, and we'll share afterwards.
It's a lot though. I mean, I guess my thought was, and we've done this with another piece of legislation in the recent past, that probably there are going to be sort of grunt work, boring meetings involving planning and law, sitting around a table and working through some of these. And I think that would be the administration's request. Again, not that anything is not discussed today, but that we have an opportunity to kind of work through this in a deliberate way, make sure that all of the questions are being resolved and all the considerations that need to be taken into account are.
If I could ask one more question, are we able to at least start that process today, or planning and law able to begin working through some of those things? And then maybe we could schedule another meeting if necessary to continue that discussion so that we could just continue with working through this?
I mean, I don't think that planning and law can have their meeting in the, within this meeting. But again, I think that the ordinance is a number of pages long. Even with 2 hours, it may be a challenge to get through the whole thing. So I had no problem with that, but I just wanted to sort of throw out that request and suggestion that we work through these other more detailed issues in a fuller way.
So we could today go through the rest of the items identified in the red line, but you're requesting that planning and law have a chance to meet outside of this meeting to reach a consensus and then come back to this group to overview those?
I think, Bill, that you're saying that there raised some issues that are bigger issues that the council is going to need to address, council and the mayor, not the planning and law can't decide what's the best policy for the city.
I think our questions are the first questions, and then those raise further policy questions that need to be worked through.
I'm sorry, when you say first questions, what do you refer to?
More specific, granular questions about provisions of the ordinance and how they relate to other existing provisions of Cleveland Heights' code.
Right.
And, sort of what we understand to be the intention of council in considering this.
Mhm.
But then that still leaves the question of what does council want to do?
Right.
But I think we need to work through those more granular items first and provide some comments back, probably on a consolidated basis, to the council.
Okay.
And then again, you guys can decide if that is in committee of the whole. There's a finance committee component in my view, again.
So you're thinking that you could take that document, the department could work through it, provide those comments back, and then we could revisit it, see whether there are things that we could fold in, whether there's anything else that needs to be discussed. Is that correct? Am I
I think
hearing
that's
that correctly?
essentially correct, yeah,
Okay.
with the caveat that I'm not sure who all is involved in sort of the second stage of the discussion.
And that's what I was bringing up. Originally, when administration reached out, I was still the chair of planning and development, and a lot of these questions were gonna have to be discussed. So no matter what, you're looking at multiple committee meetings once you start talking about the financial aspect of it. So it's gonna have to move out of this committee sooner or later to at least go to finance to have some of these conversations with the other council members in order to get this passed, because you're not gonna get answers to all of these questions today. And even when they come back, you're gonna have members of this council on additional committees where those answers may impact the legislation and the work that they're doing. So I know no matter what we do here today, it's gonna end up at least, it sounds like, in finance committee. But I'm thinking it's gonna still touch some planning and stuff. So I think it's outside of this committee, it's gonna have this piece of legislation, no matter what's gonna have to move. Even if you bring it back here, it won't be enough to get through other council because you've got other considerations for the other committees that need to take place now with these questions. So I see us discussing it today, but I don't see us coming to a resolution on many of these things without them moving through the other committees, specifically finance, for some of these.
So recognizing that there's a lot of commonality between the version suggested by the mayor and the council president's current version, I'm hopeful that today, at least in the red line version, we can make it through all of those. And then after this meeting, the law department will take a look at what planning suggested and make any recommendations on there. We could revisit that. And then I think that it sounds like it could go to finance after this for that finance-related question. Is that an okay approach with folks? That we, after hearing back from the law department, reconvene to see those housing-related issues that might be able to be folded in.
I'd say hear back from the administration, because again, I think we need to
Right.
figure out who all is involved. And I know everyone's sick of hearing me say, you all should talk about this, but I think this is a piece of legislation that is broad in its scope, and the subject matter is a little different than what we typically deal with also, so.
I think, for example, like, let's use the excise tax, that's an easier example. The big question is, do we want to do that? The second question is, if we do want to do it, do we want to apply it to hotels too, which most communities do, but we don't have one because we don't have any hotels. Those are the kind of questions that law has been, seeking input from both council and the administration, but is not in a position to probably even make recommendations. It's really policy decision.
I guess with regard to that specific thing, I think that there is alignment. So the mayor included that in his proposal and the council president accepted that. So I think that there is alignment between the administration and council on that particular question.
Yeah.
But
I was using that as an example.
your office's work in reviewing this proposal will identify other potential things. Right, and say, okay, I think that the administration and council need to come in alignment on X, Y, Z. Is that?
Or to figure out what they want to do, because even that initial administration version was an initial draft. It hasn't gone through a process of sort of, again, being broken down to that granular level. And part of the point of that is to make sure council is making intentional, fully informed policy decisions. And not doing accidentally something that it doesn't really want to do, or not achieving something that it really does want to do. And again, there's just a lot of details involved in this particular legislation.
So just for clarification, whenever we get the document back from your office, it'll say, this is an instance where the administration and council needs to reach consensus. Is that so that we know what is outstanding and what needs to be worked through when we get it back?
I haven't thought that through yet, but my guess is that we'll probably provide comments that are more substantive about, pros, cons, or things that the city should be thinking about in connection with a particular, part of the ordinance. And then again, the legislative authority and the administration will figure out how they're going to reach consensus and or decisions on that.
Just so that we could sort of set an expectation, do you know about when we might be able to expect to hear back?
I don't, but I think it's going to take, you won't have it for Monday. I think it's going to
Tuesday?
I think it's going to take a little time, I would say that.
Like 2 weeks, a month?
I think we're looking at something, we can probably get through that process and have some meaningful input within a month, certainly.
Okay.
That seems
Okay.
fair.
So, so just to go back and overview what we just discussed. So today we're going to try to continue to work through the differences outlined in the red line version. After the meeting, the law department will take a look at what the planning department identified, and then within a month, hopefully get back to us with some of the things that we might need to further address. And then after that, the legislation may need to go to the finance committee to talk through finance-related issues.
That sounds right.
Okay, so are there any other questions before we continue through the red line version? Okay, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. With that, I think I'm going to excuse myself.
Okay.
I really wanted to have that conversation because we just started to look at this additional input this morning, and I thought it was important for the committee to think about that at least. You're in capable hands from the legal perspective with Lori, and I'm going to go work on some other things.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so the next difference is at the end of the third page of the red line version, which for the entire packet is page 8. Under registration
Mr. Chairman?
requirements. Yes.
Sorry, if I could just ask, I don't know if you wanted us to share our comments on those components that are agreed, but if there are no differences between the two versions, but we still have questions that we'd like to be working with law on those particular.
So I guess, so given that the law department is going to take a look at it, do we think that it would be better to wait for them to take a look at it before we discuss it? Or do we want to discuss it here, see if there is some sort of update that we want to provide?
Having
Whenever you pass it along
seen
to the
Eric's
law department.
comments, I think more of them are comments that need to be addressed by council or the mayor or both. To make, for instance, do we treat short-term rentals different from rentals and things like that? We can have most of these. The law department, may have a little bit of insight on a couple of them, but most of them are really policy decisions that I don't think
So Lori, would you be okay with us addressing them here and then just making an update on your document before they take a look at it?
And I think we can be
I think that's
short
a
with
good
our comment,
idea,
we don't
because they're
necessarily.
all connected.
Yeah, okay, sure. So, where,
So the first comment we have is section 76901 definitions B operator. Which currently reads means any person who offers a short-term rental or holds a short-term rental out to the public for rental by placing advertisements or solicitations with the housing platform. So as it's currently written, that could be the property owner or somebody they hire, which is the more likely scenario. So does the property owner have to be involved in the process is sort of a question. I think we want to be careful how we determine.
And what I think law would say to that is, what are the pros and cons of having the property owner involved, requiring them to be involved in terms of administration and enforcement? You know, that's our issue. Like when we're talking about having a local agent or something, for instance, you do that so you have somebody who can speed it into court. Some of the same issues, I think, with long-term rentals and short-term rentals. And once again, those are policy decisions the council has to make and not so much what we make a recommendation on, although sometimes we do. I mean, I have an opinion on operator, but I think that's my opinion personally and not as an assistant law director, so.
So generally, I would say, first of all, I really don't get involved in that level, on the definition level. That's something that the law director puts forth. I mean, obviously, I look it over. The technical stuff I leave, to the department. But looking at this, it is the law here that if you're an absentee landlord, that you must have a local management company. That is the law, and I don't know if operator covers both.
Of course, we're in court on that.
Okay.
Just
Okay.
for what it's worth.
I'm just saying, I know South Euclid has, and I know a lot of.
I'm not saying it's
same
not.
law.
But ultimately isn't even on, just as a question for the housing side of it, isn't ultimately, even though there, you could get managers involved, ultimately speaking, the owner is the final straw, like that's who you would expect to be responsible for the property ultimately, correct?
But if we're defining operator as a certain thing and then we're citing the operator as the person later
Yep.
on, we need to make sure that
Yep.
it's this
do you
narrow.
happen to have a preference? I'm sorry for cutting you.
Well, I think this should mesh with the other ordinances that we have in place that says, okay, we're assigning a local agent, that you have to assign a local agent, right? You have to, there's certain requirements that we've already established, and those definitions should match or be more specific on this, whether it's operator, whether it's whatever web platform, right? If we're gonna term the operator the web platform that they're using, right? Or is it the local agent on the ground? So what are we actually trying to define here? And we don't want to duplicate that in other ordinances that we already have. So part of, all our comments are going to be programmatic questions on how does this mesh with the existing ordinance that we have, right? And making those more seamless, than competing against each other.
Generally, your comments relating to distinguishing short-term rentals from regular rentals, that's something that everybody needs to be aware of, and we need to look at those questions. I personally, my opinion, and I think Bill would probably agree, I don't think we should rewrite the ordinance to try to encompass short-term rentals and regular rentals. I haven't seen any other community do that. But you want to be cognizant of the differences. If there are any differences, why are the differences and how are they related to the difference in operation?
So I guess my question is, again, is there a particular alternative that would be better for us to include here?
I think this is where we're gonna make recommendations to match the language of other parts of the code.
Okay.
So that'll be part
So
of
this is an instance. Okay.
And you'll see, I'm sorry, I'll
No,
sort of
please,
dominate the
please.
conversation.
And I'm
because
sorry for talking so.
you'll
No,
see
you're
some-
trying to, I love the efficiency of trying to actually accomplish something.
Okay. Okay, are there any?
Yeah, I'm just gonna run through them.
Of course.
And you'll see, again, it's sort of the same theme.
Yeah.
D, responsible person. Number one of that is a natural person. So the first question there is, what does that mean? Natural person? I think actually it's an important point.
We know what a natural person means. That's defined in law as a human being.
So-
Not including a frozen embryo,
So an AI.
or not including a corporation, basically. Because corporations and LLCs can be considered people for some purposes, but natural person means an actual living body.
But just what you heard there, so this would not include an LLC as a responsible person right now, as it's currently written.
Or should it?
Well, responsible person, that's not operator, that's responsible person.
Right, responsible.
Do we want a responsible person that we can bring into court if there's a problem?
So are you
Or
saying
do
that
you
it's
want
okay,
it,
Lori?
or do you wanna just allow LLCs to do this? I mean, somebody could buy up a bunch of houses and operate them as an LLC, have no local presence, and not have anybody really that you could bring citations against if you need to. I think probably Alan could speak more to that. The
Right.
difficulties with that. But that, to me, responsible person is not the same as operator in this definition of the code.
So again, I think we're gonna go through the code and
Yeah.
and make sure that it lines up with what we're saying in other sections. Similarly, 3 of that is the responsible person has to live within 50 miles of the short-term rental, which is different than what we have in other sections, which is in county or that local agent. So we will make those recommendations that are
Okay.
aligning with that.
Mr. Chair, while you do that, I do not wanna leave out LLCs, please. They are just too much a part of this problem with the situation.
And again, that's part of the
Specifically,
will do,
policy that I
yeah.
wanted
Yeah.
here.
Thank you.
In E, short-term rental, so it means any residential unit or part thereof. So the question we have on that is, as that's written, you could conceivably rent out a room within, just one room within the dwelling unit as a short-term rental. We're proposing to allow that currently.
rooming unit, no.
I'm sorry, for clarification, did you say that's an E?
E1,
In reserve?
So the,
Oh, part there.
so the or part thereof is very important.
do we currently allow in our ordinances dwelling units, like I know some places don't,
What did you, I'm sorry.
like a dwelling
I-
unit as in like a one, just a
room.
bedroom,
Dwelling unit
you
would
can
be
rent,
defined
a
as
dwelling
something with
unit,
a
yeah.
kitchen. But that's a question that we've had, and I don't know if law feels like we have clear guidance on this, although we've asked the question of the mayor and of council president and gotten answers and worked with that. But what about somebody who runs bed and breakfast like my mother does? She rents out 3 rooms. She's always on the premises when those rooms are rented out. I'm not saying you shouldn't regulate those the same as short-term rental, you should, but you're distinguishing based on outside characteristics, like is a person and partial, I mean, I guess there's infinite possibilities, which kind of draws you into warrant of confusion if you try to say, well, if I have a 2-family and I rent out 1 unit, is that a short-term rental? I mean, it's kind of a hybrid of the two, but what was the purpose of the short-term rental ordinance? What's the harms you're trying to stop and how does that relate to it? It's just the general question that we ask.
So this language as written would cover the example of your mother
Yes.
having the bed and breakfast.
Yes,
And so I guess are you saying that that's like a policy conversation that we need to have? Are we okay with having a single bedroom in a place rented out?
Right, as an Airbnb or one of those platforms. Currently, we do not regulate an owner occupant renting out a room in their property. It's not considered a rental in our ordinance. So this would add, a part thereof, right? That would be now required a dwelling unit is defined as a separate unit, right?
With a kitchen?
Kitchen, facility, right?
This is work.
if it's 4 or more people, then it's a boarding house and there's different considerations that's already dealt with in the zoning code, and there's different considerations probably based on parking and other issues that you would expect. But as it's written now, it is gonna include any anybody who rents out a room.
So I know my thoughts, but like, what about you two
So,
for policy
Yeah,
preferences?
the long-term rental of a bedroom is already addressed. I did look that up as.
Short-term rentals, though.
But on the short-term rental, this does specifically address it in the sense that if it's an owner-occupied unit, it says, 1 to 29 days. So it
It
defines,
covers it.
it covers it. So I don't know if something needs to be done to this language here. That's the technical end.
I think what planning is asking is, do we want this to be
Right.
written?
It's a
Do
policy,
you have a
Right.
preference?
because it will be allowing the short-term rental of
Of a
Bedroom.
a bedroom
or
or
it could be a corner. of it.
basement.
Yeah, it could be anything. It says a part thereof, a dwelling unit, so it
I
could
mean,
be.
a closet for
A
all.
closet, yes.
My guess is that that's probably happening. And so do we want to disallow that? My thought is that it would probably be good to keep it as it is so that that is allowed. So that we're not, disallowing something that's currently being done.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to do no harm to revenue streams for
Yeah.
people who feel they need this. That was my intent.
So
Right,
you're
that's
okay
the way
with
it's
this
written.
I am,
language?
and I don't know if the mayor, I assume, I don't specifically remember if this was in the mayor's version.
Director Zamp, do you have a
Well,
preference?
it's not red line, so it's a shared.
Okay,
It's in
I
there.
guess-
Do you have a preference,
Yes,
Director Zamp?
okay, I just didn't remember reading it.
I think that it will become increasingly hard to, while I agree that these things are happening, just like we know people are renting out their homes and rooms, it will become increasingly hard to track and
Yeah.
enforce.
Well, I was gonna say the enforcement side of it is, yeah, they're out there, but if the whole point of this is to enforce certain standards expectations, that would get hard to do.
Well,
It's a single room.
if I may, on the enforcement end, one of the things I put in the legislation is that if there were complaints that the entity, because I don't know what word to use right now, must show the rental agreement. And that's the enforcement mechanism. That's the piece that's missing now, because right now there's no regulation of it and we don't know who it is. So and it would be complaint-driven enforcement. I mean, that's when you would see if somebody is indeed following the law. If there was a complaint and the department that was assigned this, I assume it's gonna be inspectional services, but that's the mayor's call, would be able to on demand ask for the rental agreement. And then at that time, it would be it could be noted whether or not the rental agreement was being followed under this statute, this new statute.
So suppose the language were any residential dwelling unit, semicolon. So we do not include or part thereof. And then someone who is renting out a bedroom, there's a noise complaint, they would not be covered by this. So
That's
by including it, and then we could say, and then let's say that, compare this with the situation where it does include this language or part thereof. Again, they rent out a bedroom, they have a noise complaint, but they are not registered. In that case, they would be covered and we would be able to say, you're covered by this, you're not, you have not received your occupancy permit, yada, yada, yada. Whereas if we don't include it and there is an issue, then we can't say, well, you don't have an occupancy permit to do this because they wouldn't be covered by this. So my thought is that it would be better to include it so that if there is an issue, they would be covered by this and we would be able to address it. Whereas if they're not covered by this, then it seems like it would be more difficult to do that. Is that,
That's what you thought, Councilman Kudas, and I mean, that's the understanding we
Lori,
got.
did that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, that.
You're trying to encompass
The question we're raising.
everyone who's using the platform for whatever purpose. The difference being is that we don't do that if they rent it out long-term. So they could rent out their bedroom long-term and not have any restrictions on the city's regulations as far as rental registration. It's only on the short-term that we're excluding those separate portions of the dwelling units that they typically occupy.
Well,
So again, you're talking about consistency between what we already have and
Right.
trying to
And
make
if,
this.
and if that's if that's the goal that we're trying to attain, whether we're trying to, encompass everyone, right? The mom and pop who have a sort of a live-in suite downstairs, right, or upstairs, and they're renting it out as portion of their property, is that what we is that the goal we're looking to do, right? And that's not really our version, that's a policy case that we're looking at.
Yeah, I maybe phrase it a different way. Stepping into policy for a second, so let's say we have a one-family dwelling, it's got 3 bedrooms, and I live next door to it. So I know that the maximum number of guests who could be there, well, not maximum number of people who are staying in, maximum number of people that are, not people, what's the word I'm looking for? There should only be 3 guests there at a maximum, because they have 3 unit. I'm saying this wrong. It's a single family dwelling unit. So I live next door. It's an Airbnb. I can assume that there should only be 1 dwelling unit being rented out.
Right, but it could be a husband and wife or something staying
Right.
in one of the bedrooms.
It could be husband and wife. It could be
So it
entire
could-
family. But as it's currently written, that single family dwelling that has 3 bedrooms could have 3 separate families renting out those bedrooms. And I think part of the purpose of this entire thing is we're saying that these tend to be impactful in our residential neighborhoods because of parking and noise. And that's, you're creating an occupancy that is much higher.
And if I could respond to that, so my thought is that there could be a chance that that is already happening. And by including the language or part thereof, then that gives us jurisdiction over that to say that is covered by this, that behavior, those actions are covered by this. Whereas if we do not include that, I think that we are only looking at or residential dwelling units, so the entire thing. So are we limiting ourselves by not including that language? So if someone is doing something like what you just described and we don't include that language, are we not able to address that?
Well, so I think if we get a complaint and we go over and we say, hey, show us the contract, and shows 3 families already, you said this is a single family unit, that's an illegal, the whole entire thing is illegal.
Okay,
So we were able to enforce it that way.
okay.
So I think we have it on both ways, but one, you're actually being permissive in allowing it to
Right.
happen in the first place.
I see.
So
This
if
is,
they-
this is allowing that action to happen.
and I would
There are
think,
pros and cons, and what you don't wanna do is when you be in a selective enforcement situation, even mentally, where you're saying that, well, these small things, we're not gonna pay any attention to unless we get a complaint. I mean, if we enact a regulatory scheme, it should apply to everybody who's doing it as best as we know. That's
Or you
why,
could specifically put something out right in here that denies the right to even do that in the first place. Therefore, if it happens, then you can say you can't do it, but I know that's what you're trying to avoid because I know
Right.
you don't wanna limit revenue streams for.
So I have a question, Director Butler. Right now, there's already a limit to how many people can be. Is it per bedroom? Like, what's the occupancy permit of a house? Is it square foot or bedrooms?
Oh.
Yeah, so the maximum occupancy for a dwelling unit is calculated by square footage of habitable space, the lesser of the number, and sleeping area. So that's how we calculate a maximum allowable occupancy per dwelling unit.
So let me ask you a follow-up question. Would that be a question on the form that people who are doing short-term rentals would be filling out? Is, how many square feet is your house? And then there would be some information given to them as to how many people they could possibly even rent to at a given time?
So I think most of the current rental data we have an occupant load for the property. But when we get into some of these variations of it, right, what portion are they renting out, right? Does it exceed the maximum allowable occupancy? And then we have other versions where we get into, boarding houses type of thing where how many different people unrelated are moving into, a unit.
And what constitutes a family, I remember that, yes.
So there's a number of different factors involved. Maximum occupant load is the one we typically go by.
And the occupancy load, in my mind, it applies to everybody.
Sure.
It technically even applies to, single family houses. I mean, we have the ability, 3-bedroom house with 12 kids that are tiny bedrooms to say you really can't live there. So we don't need to do anything special to enforce the occupancy limit. The question, I guess, would be if people are renting a short-term rental and they're gonna have more than the occupancy load, are they really gonna admit to that? Are they gonna admit that I wanna rent this house for 12 people, or is just 2 people gonna rent the house and the rest are gonna come over and have a party?
So I'd be fine with moving on. I'd just like to hear what the recommendation would be when you get together. I mean, that's where I'm at on this
Yep.
particular one. When there's a discussion between you and legal,
Well, we can highlight it as a policy decision and then a suggestion.
Okay, good.
to keep,
Opinion.
right, and to keep it consistent, I'm all about that. That's kind of what I count on the law department to do, really, is to make sure that anything we do is consistent with what we already have. And I think that's a great place where you jumped in here.
And please don't be like hesitant in suggesting something because,
No.
you are the experts in this area. And so, you probably are better informed on some of these things than we are. And so if you have a strong opinion on it, please let us know so that we could take that into consideration. But okay, so moving on from that one.
So yeah, jumping ahead to F, transient guests, one distinction we'd like to make here is it talks about in the second sentence, whereby the person or persons pays rent to the operator. Well, it's really they make a payment. I know it's wordsmithing, but
I'm sorry, could you say that one more time?
they make a payment to the operator.
Make the payment.
They're not really paying rent because rent is a pretty specific term. But we did think that this section 1 and 2 in particular is good language that we'd like to maybe look at integrating into the housing code more generally.
Oh, okay.
G and H, this is just an example of what the law director was alluding to. These are terms that are, and actually here they're referred to other sections of the code. So we want to make sure that what it says in other sections of the code is in line with what we're saying here. Because again, if this came from Cincinnati, their definition may have been different. And if we do want to change those sections, including the ones where it's zoning, then there's an entirely different process that we have to go through. And we likely will make some recommendations along those lines. Section 76902, registration requirements. This is really where we talk about how this should align much more with what we do for rental registration. So right now it's a very different process. I'm not going to go through all the instances of where it's different, but that's really, this is where it starts to come out that these are somewhat unique as compared to what we do typically.
I don't think you need to grandfather in people who are doing it now, but you certainly need to give them time to comply with the registration requirements. And from a legal perspective.
Yeah, and just as a sideline, I did, not knowing about what you're telling us today, and not previously knowing about that, I did set it out to August as, for both a community, not relations, but just an informational time period where, this could be disseminated to, especially to the owners and the operators and so forth. So I did think about that, and depending on how long this takes, I will be glad to, move the dates, to make that information sharing period happen. I think that's a very important part of this policy.
So
No, isn't January 1st the date that we require rental registrations
Correct.
and business occupancy registrations?
Sorry.
I mean, we can put this in force before that, but you do your comments about having one date where registration is required make a lot of sense,
So to that point, just skipping ahead to
probably.
what is this E here? Do you see the
C.
in 76903E?
4E or
What did I say?
You're at the end of page 9, I think.
lowercase e.
Lowercase e, so 76903 short-term rental registration, E.
Short-term rental.
We are saying that should be valid for just 1 year. Or really until the end of the year. So we want the short-term rental registration to be an annual thing, but if they applied in July, then they should only get until December 31st, because we do this on an annual basis.
for long-term.
Right.
Got it. That's really important. No kidding.
So through the end of the calendar year.
Yes.
So, Mr. Chair, I think that the reason that's in there is to try to take some of the burden off the department staff. But in the long run, it sounds like you're saying because it's not consistent with long-term rentals, that it adds burden.
Yeah, and just think about, your own self, when you do something on every third year, sometimes you forget.
Yeah.
But if you do it every year,
I have rental property and I have to do it every year. Now, the certificate of occupancy, does that go hand in hand with this registration?
Well, I think that's what we'd like to see it happen, right? Not create a whole separate rental registration, that it becomes part of that process.
Okay.
And just how those nuances work. And I think when we think about it, who's the onus gonna be on? Is it gonna be on the owner of the property, or are we gonna put it more on the operator for this definition, right? To provide us information and check those boxes. So I think part of the whereas is we wanna be able to track them, right? That's when we wanna figure out where and what, so that if there are issues, we know who to contact. So, we're making some recommendations. Let's keep it consistent with the occupancy expiration. Those would get reviewed at one time, right, instead of reviewing them as they come in. And we're just trying to meld the two occupancy ordinance versus the short-term rental.
Okay, so I think that we may have looked over one of the things that was included in Council President Kuda's version. So that's section 769.02. C, registration of a property under this chapter shall be distinct from rental registration under chapter 1347 of this code. So is that okay to include from your perspective? Or
and I think that's the point that we're trying to make is, and maybe it's just wordsmithing it, because what we don't want is a completely separate process.
Okay.
So
Right.
they may need to register.
The form is separate, that's it.
Right.
So would you prefer that we remove this?
I think we
Just
can make a
wordsmith it.
recommendation to how we can say it, but not so that it's confusing.
Okay. Okay, so I guess then that takes us back to the end of page 9. So there isn't another difference until page 12. So do you happen to have?
Well, we don't know if
Right, that's
you might have something in
So, I'm not going through every one here because they're somewhat the same, but I just wanted to highlight this one. So in 76904G, that's the last one. Proof of liability insurance for short-term rental, equivalent to $500 per occurrence.
500,000.
Well, it says $500.
It says 500,000.
It says
Oh,
500,
okay.
but it's 500,000.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, so that needs to
The
be.
numbers say 500,000, the words say 500.
Correct, yes.
Oh,
So we don't require this for long-term rentals. But the distinction here in that second sentence of that it's essentially gonna come from the hosting platform probably makes it not an undue burden, but I think we'd want to just make sure that that's not going to put people out of business.
Do we not require insurance at all for our rental owners?
No.
I'm shocked by that.
So, right, again, that's another thing you would have to check on there, proof of insurance. Right, one of the things, and that's a policy decision. Do
Yeah.
we want it on long term, right, then,
It's a lot of work.
Sure is.
I mean, it would be a lot of work for regular rentals if we had to examine the insurance policy of every
I did that.
tenant.
I did, it was the homeowner's insurance.
It's difficult enough with the building department and looking at the insurance policies of contractors.
Right.
But from a legal perspective, you can treat them differently if you think there's a reason to treat them differently. And in this case, I think you could do either one.
So if the hosting, like if Airbnb has some sort of insurance, and I guess we just don't know exactly how that works, so if I rent a Airbnb and I destroy the place, then how does that work? You know, does the person need to have their own insurance to be covered, or is it the hosting platform?
So if something is provided by the hosting platform, that's sort of like icing on the cake if this requirement doesn't exist. Otherwise, if we do create this requirement and it's not offered by the hosting platform, then people would have to go out and get it, right?
And fine.
We'd have to determine whether they had it or not.
Right.
I would just say that this is probably something that's consistent with Cincinnati's, you know.
Their regular,
Yeah,
Rental,
right.
yeah.
And you know, this is the kind of thing that, you know, I was not looking to add, you know, I'm just talking about me. I was not looking to add a layer of,
Bureaucracy.
yeah,
I think you included it probably just because it was in the mayor's suggested
correct.
version.
which is,
But that's, I would question whether or not we should do this just for short-term rentals.
or.
You know, that's a policy decision that I, you know, I mean, I know you're, but yeah, that's something that's an all or nothing thing to me. I don't know why we would single this out and say, and make this a mandatory
For just.
for just short-term.
Cincinnati did?
Well, you know what, my sense is they probably
They
did.
probably did, they probably already had that there.
They probably put this in here because it's consistent with their, you know, overall housing legislation or code.
It's an interesting question. I've never heard of a I don't know if community housing codes, rental codes require insurance. I have
Newburgh
not.
Heights did.
Yeah, she's,
We required full replacement value insurance for all our rental
Who?
properties. Newburgh Heights, Housing and Building Department.
Really?
They had
But
to provide
do
proof of
they enforce it and
insurance.
see if it actually happens?
Hmm?
Do they enforce that and require
Yes.
people to?
Yes, I would sit there and actually, you wouldn't get a certificate of occupancy.
Well,
if
now
I did.
if we're gonna do this, then we give the job to Addie.
Well, I've got plenty of experience in it.
I mean, how many rental properties do we have in Cleveland Heights?
You would be surprised too at the amount of times that I had to call insurance agents and say, hey, like, you know, get specific, because we're very specific about it. They were like, you guys require full replacement value? Yeah, we do. They were shocked.
That particular provision would require a large amount of
Yeah.
staff time. The question
Yeah.
is whether that's worth it to council.
So it seems like it might be
a lot
worth
of work.
removing this.
It was just me.
then.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question that, right, what's the value of it, right? Is the platform providing that? And it says per occurrence, so is this every time somebody rents it, they need to show us that they have that? And what is it protecting, right? Is it $500,000 or is it $500? $500,000, I would think. And again, to what end is that gonna be applied, right? If they burn a house down or if they,
There was a guy who burned 3 of his properties down in Newburgh Heights at the same time.
But I would also add that this is a risk that a business owner or a property owner takes.
Yeah.
And that, let's assume that part of their business plan is to make sure they're protecting themselves, so I think we could leave it off. Just,
and typically if they have a mortgage on it, right,
yes,
the lender would want insurance on it. It's typically, I don't run into a whole lot of problems unless it's right, owed free and clear and they decide not to have it, so.
all the more reason to.
Isn't it, right? You have a bigger protection.
Just to note, we have about a half hour left, so we can continue working through as much as we can. And then we will keep an eye out for the document from the law department and regroup in about a month. but, okay.
Next
Or-
section, section 76905, which is this renewal. Again, we're making no recommendation, we'll be making a recommendation that it should line up with what we do for rental registrations. Having an A this complicated, 180 days, no later than 60 days. I can't even understand it, just reading it, imagine trying to do that in practice. So we would just tie it to how we do our rental renewal. In B, it talks about a renewal fee. We have a general comment that the fees should be established. There's a couple of different fees besides the excise tax, so there should be a section in here or separately that talks about what fees would be required that are in addition to our typical.
There's a provision in here for the collection of fee. It
Right.
does not set the amount.
Right.
It'd be good to put in the ordinance what the amount will be,
Exactly.
but I presume that's something that we do when we get closer to finalization.
Right, if there is a separate fee for the short-term rental versus the regular occupancy.
I mean, certainly.
There's cause to say that there is additional review we have to do, that, you know, as we're getting litigation from our other out of county, right? What makes it different? What are the additional costs involved?
Mm-hmm.
For example, if you did include the insurance, that would be an additional cost to have to go.
Right, for reviewing that, right, for sure.
I suppose there's another
fee-
thing that your form could say, require that you have insurance and just take their word for it. Well, I mean,
That's
seriously,
true. I mean,
it's
if it's there,
very
then-
difficult
Right.
to you get involved in so many questions. I said even the building contractors, we get involved in so many questions about whether the insurance policy complies with the city's requirement. And there's a lot, probably fewer of them than short-term rentals.
Right.
Or definitely long-term rentals.
Yeah, so it calls for a payment, but it doesn't give an amount.
Section 76907, avoidance of nuisances. You'll see in here, it talks about in the second sentence.
So the payment is 76905B.
For the nuisances, 3 or more written citations or notices of violations, that's what's being defined in here, but we in section 55307 define those things differently, which is more than 2 in a 6-month period or 1 felony, so we will be recommending it should mirror what that says.
Okay.
Council President Coop, would you, generally speaking, be okay with that mirroring?
Yes.
Okay, good.
So in 76908B, which is the limitations on the operation of short-term rentals.
What number are you on? I'm sorry.
76908B.
Oh, 8.
And this is for multifamily buildings, essentially.
Yeah, I don't know.
The 1 through 3 are confusing to us. The way it's written, there's a formula. For buildings containing 4 or fewer dwellings, there's no limit on the number of short-term rentals. Now, we may have made that a little bit better by removing the part thereof, but conceivably you could have 4 guests. For buildings containing 5 or more, you can have 4 short-term rentals plus 1 additional short-term rental for every 4 dwelling units in excess of 4 dwelling units is permitted. It starts to get complicated. So
Meaning, if you have 8, then you can only have 5 short-term, that's
I don't know where this came. It obviously came from Cincinnati or somewhere. Somebody's draft that somebody had. I mean, personally, I thought if you're the 1 unit in a 5-unit building, that's not a short-term rental. What's the purpose of this, I guess, is the question. What are you're trying to either combine all your short-term rentals to the same building or to spread out the short-term rentals to different buildings if you're talking about multifamily. I think reading this, I wasn't sure what the purpose of it, what the intent was.
Do you have a preference?
It's a good question.
Scrap it all?
rapid.
Well, I think that, I know we heard concerns, almost more so for the multifamily buildings than for the single-family buildings for short-term rentals, because you're actually living in close proximity to the person as opposed to at least having a side yard setback. So I think we need to look at this again,
Okay.
but
Even to this end too, so if you have an apartment building and you have 2 of the units being rented out as short-term rent, does that require 2 registrations even, right, versus just 1 parcel? So I think there's when we're going into the building and count units, it poses some problematic questions as to how do we operate that?
Do you have a preference here?
Well, I know there are landlords that have some long-term and some short-term in the same building, and there is no provision in here, the last time I checked, which was pretty recently, that it would require them to have both permits for short and longer.
But yes, you would, I think.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I think you would be required. to
yeah,
have
you
both
would be, according to this.
Right.
On the,
Sorry, only if this language is included or even in the absence of this language in 1, 2, 3?
Even in the absence of that
Yeah.
language.
yeah,
So
But
is
now,
that,
as we break it down even closer, right, into more, right, do we need multiple registrations for each unit? If there's multiple short-term rentals in there? And then, what is the purpose for controlling, right? Do we have a whole building that's, and not that that's much of an issue here, right? But, right, in vacation areas, the entire building is short-term rental.
That's actually a good point, because somebody could make the argument that if they have a whole building of short-term rentals, they only need to put in one registration that isn't really dealt with clearly here.
How does that work for long-term? They pay, when they do a certificate of occupancy, they don't pay just $200 for the whole building.
It's a flat fee and then a per unit fee for the whole building. So
would you be suggesting
With the
that we
maximum.
Yeah,
adopt
with the
something
cap.
similar here that mirrors what we have for the long terms?
Yeah.
Is it,
So
okay,
doesn't 3 times as many short-term rentals have 3 times as many potential problems? And maybe not 3 times as much attention that you need to give to it, but theoretically, 3 times as much attention that you need to give to it. It's also theoretically 3 times the revenue, so you could treat it either way from a legal perspective. You need to look at what your administrative burden is.
but if they were regular units, it would still be 3 times the revenue, right? That's dwelling units.
Right.
do you have a strong preference? Or would you be okay with it mirroring what we have for the long term?
that would be my preference, to mirror the long-term rental, and I'm assuming it's one fee for the building and then a smaller, like $200, I mean, I'm not saying that it is, and then each additional unit would be some lesser amount, right? I mean, is that the way it is now?
Right.
Yeah,
And there would be a distinction between the short-term and the long-term rentals. I guess the bigger policy question is, do we care? So if I have a 4-unit building, I can have 4 short-term rental units in there. But if I have a 5-unit building or larger, I am, according to this, I can't do all my units as short-term rentals. Is that something we really care about? Or would we be fine with a 10-unit building that's 10 units of short-term rentals?
Do you have a strong preference?
I was not looking to regulate the number of units. I mean, but I haven't thought about that either. That was not, I'm just saying that was not part of my initial intent, was to force people who are doing multiples to decrease.
Do you have a preference?
I think this requires some thought on my part to give even an opinion.
I think we'll look at it, we'll try to mirror what we have in the long term, and we'll make a suggestion. But where I'm sitting right now is I think we don't get into the business of limiting the number of units, because then it becomes a very big burden.
Well, then you get into the selective enforcement thing, right? Is that true, Laura?
Excuse me.
Well, if you say you can have 4 units, but if you have 5 or more, we're gonna tell you where you have to stop. Is that selective enforcement?
It's not selective enforcement, but there has to be a rational basis for any distinction we make here between short-term rentals, long-term rentals, 1 unit, 3 units. I mean, there has to be a rational basis for making that distinction. I'm not sure, again, I'm not sure where it came from, even though I probably wrote it somewhere, but if it's as a policy matter, do we want to encourage multiple rentals in one building or discourage? When I originally read it, I thought we were trying to discourage a long-term tenant being stuck in a building with a lot of short-term rentals. I have no idea. I don't know if we've looked at whether that's an issue or problem here.
Yeah, it looks like they're saying, 20% of the building has to be a long-term rental for the most part, right? And
And I guess what I'm saying is,
over 5 units.
so fine is the concern, some of the concerns that I've heard have been actually in those interactions, the long and short-term rental interaction, because they are so close. So we're actually creating that situation with the way it's written right now.
And I will say that is a concern that has been brought up several times. I'm not gonna put a number on it, but it has been brought up
About multiple
from
units.
tenants.
But
Yes,
About too many.
about the frequency of the coming and
Right.
going with people who are there.
shouldn't that be a smaller number then? I mean, would you want to allow 4 out of 5 to be short-term rentals? Seems like under that rationale, you might only want 1 out of 5 to be allowed to be short-term rentals.
Well, I guess I'd make the argument the other way, which is it's actually better to have a short-term rental building.
You're thinking of having them all in one place?
Yeah, because
Right.
But
then they're used to. They're not expecting
It's-
the privacy.
I mean, it's the same dynamic as a hotel.
Right.
You expect people to come and go. It's a policy decision and it's, I would defer to your I would certainly want to hear your recommendation. I wouldn't want to say 100% I'd go along with it no matter what, but,
Not to throw another wrench in there, but I know a lot of cities who've done, instead of specific by building, is percentage by neighborhood of allowable short-term rentals. Sorry.
most of our apartment buildings don't even, a lot of our apartment buildings don't even have enough parking spaces for the tenants that are there.
and the problem is when you get started with this, you have no idea how that's all going to shake out.
Right.
You make a law one way and then, because we don't know who's doing it now. So, I mean,
That could always be something you address later if there's
exactly,
issues.
exactly.
So I know at the end of this section, E and F are actually differences.
Yes.
Yes.
And I think we wanna look at this one a little bit closer.
Okay.
Because this is, there's some timeframes in there and how we would be able to check on. I know we were living there for 270 days and not 245 days, like, we wanna be able to think about that first.
Yeah, that was a common
I know.
number that I saw across many pieces of, or many ordinances.
Yeah.
But
And I know we had a comment on your original legislation, which I just couldn't find in time for the meeting,
Yeah.
but I think we have an idea of how to tweak this. Just to have it with.
I would say E and F are very important.
Yeah.
Elements.
Yeah, I don't think we're saying to remove it, just,
Right, but
uh,
again, comporting and is it the wise policy?
So the next red line difference is on page 14. Director Zamp, do you have anything between the end of page 12 and this red line on page 14?
which is the appeals, right, 769.
Correct.
Yeah, the other stuff is really just trying to mirror other sections. But in this section, actually, we think, we had a comment on the original version, which was which board of review, so this provides that very specifically, which is the Board of Appeals,
Do you prefer this? Is that?
absolutely.
Okay.
In section 76999 penalty will limit the comment, but actually, that section in particular should mirror what we do with penalties and fines, because,
You talking about letter C?
I'm sorry, 76999.
Penalty.
Which is halfway down page 14.
Just, I don't have any pages on mine, 769 what?
99.
Oh,
Penalty.
Penalty.
Hello.
There. So and that will speed up really quickly. We didn't really look at the excise tax section because
Yeah.
review, but But yeah, did want to point out that it does have hotels listed.
And so is there anything else through the end of the document, Director
Just
Zanfis?
scrolling ahead,
Immediately.
I think there was something at the
So if I could, Mr. Mayor, thank you for joining us. To overview what we've talked through, we went through the differences between your drafted proposal and Councilman Kuda's current version. But in addition to that, Director Zanfis, Assistant Director Butler talked through that red line document and identified a number of things. And so what we agreed was that after this meeting, they will share those comments with the law department, which will go through them and have a goal of completing their review within a month so that we could then reconvene and go through those things. We also talked about, after having a chance to go through those things, the law department reviews, having the legislation go over to the finance committee for the taxation component. So is that a fair sort of summary of what we've gone through and sort of decided?
If I could just add one thing that's outside of the legislation, but one thing we did want to bring up with you all is there are third-party entities out there like Granicus, if you've ever heard of it.
Sorry, Lynn.
Granicus,
Mm-hmm.
who have sort of specialized, Granicus, they're a company who have specialized in short-term rentals and being able to manage them. So there's a cost, of course, but I was on a webinar with them and they state pretty clearly, you can charge a fee that essentially can cover the cost of
Right.
them to administer this. They have all the databases, they work in, 1,000 communities.
Were they
per-
talking about GovQA? Is that the one they were, that particular software? Was that what Granicus was talking about?
I think so.
Any
Like
kind
2
of
years.
fee needs to be related to cost of enforcement. We can't say we're gonna charge $5,000 for each short-term rental as a revenue. And the city has been to court
Right.
in that context in regular rentals.
So if it's
Or it's having to be able to justify what's the administrative burden. That's separate from the excise tax.
Right.
Which is a tax which is allowed under state law and more broad-based. I think for the mayor's benefit, the only comment I would make is with regard to Director Zamp's comments, which Bill and I were just looking at before this meeting. A lot of them relate to matters of policy rather than recommendations from law or planning as far as what we think the language should be. So that's something ultimately you and council need to determine.
And if I could, one last thing. So we sort of talked through some of those policy related things today. And I think that there's a great willingness from council members to really defer to the expertise, obviously on a case by case basis. So I think if it's possible for us to discuss some of those things that are identified during our next meeting, which would be about a month from now, I think that this would, at least from my perspective, be the preferred venue to do that, just to make sure that there's a good broad consensus between the administration and council members on that. Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I did want to say, sort of in alignment with both of those statements, that what I was shopping that was drafted by the law department using Cincinnati's ordinance as a model was never intended to be the introduced version. My intention at the beginning of November, end of October, was to start a process of working with planning and development to refine it and take their operational needs and also policy concerns into account before actually sort of making it, ready for prime time. So I'm glad that we're going through this process, and I'm looking forward to digging into sort of the policy concerns and the operational needs of the department to make sure that we're not setting ourselves up for failure too. I mean, nobody wants to introduce and pass something that we can't actually accomplish. So I think that's the next step, and I'm looking forward to that too.
Would it be okay with you, as we described, to have the law department look at what Director Zanf and Mr. Butler put together, and then for it to return to this group for us to collectively read through that and just make sure that there's consensus between the administration and the committee?
Well, from my perspective, council's already going through its process, its committee process. We're happy to contribute to it. I think, so to the degree that we can contribute to council's deliberative process, we're happy to do so.
So that would be an okay venue for the administration to express its policy preferences for different things?
Are you comfortable with that?
Okay. I guess one final thing here in the red line version is a difference on whether we should include emergency language on this. So my sense is that it would be probably better if we did not, knowing that there's, more work here. I think.
I'm sorry, I
Yes,
was
of course.
just gonna say, this was not supposed to have emergency language in it, and again, the implementation was supposed to be 5 months from now. So, obviously that's a moving target now that we're figuring out.
I think it was just sort of automatically included, and I think
Yeah.
I personally at least took it out because it's kind of hard to say how this is an emergency, either on the basis of, obviously, we're gonna have more than 2 readings, but also that it has to go into effect immediately on its passage.
So when I first read this 2 weeks ago, I did send a memo to the law department. That was one of the things.
Right.
There were 3 or 4 things I said that needed to be addressed, and that was one of the things.
Yeah, just for clarification, so the current version of your legislation does not include it. I just
Yes.
see that it's a difference here, it's in the red line, and so just to make sure that there's consensus that we agree that we'll
Yes.
remove that.
So I can state from my perspective, like I said, this wasn't intended to be introduced, my version. So from my perspective, I don't see any need for this to be emergency legislation.
I mean, the basis for emergency theoretically is if you pass this and the people in the city don't like it and wanna have 30 days to get a referendum to repeal it, sometimes that's something a council is problematic in time terms. I don't see how it would be in this kind of, if the people of Cleveland Heights don't think this would be a good idea, I can't imagine the administration or the council trying to fight for it.
I might add that with as comprehensive a legislation as this is and the number of public discussions we're going to have, the word emergency just doesn't apply. So,
And again, I just want to reiterate what I discussed with the law director and what we came to a consensus on was that 5 months would be the period of time that it would take to do a community informational campaign, if you will. And also Director Butler had asked for a minimum of 30 days to create the form, but this would obviously give them more time than that. And I'm sure there's stuff that we're not even thinking about right in this moment that would need, some time to ramp this up.
So with that, we are at the end of the red line version. And so just to reiterate, the consensus is that we will, Director Zanf will send his comments over to the law department to review. The law department, as suggested by Director Hanna, should be ready in about a month with that. This group will then reconvene and be the forum for us to talk about any policy differences. And then once we have had a chance to work through all of that, then it could potentially go to the Finance Committee for those Finance Committee related components. But otherwise, is there anything else that anyone would like to?
I was just gonna suggest, at least the way I've looked at it, is the financial component of this is while part of the overall legislation is almost its own discrete conversation. So you may not wanna wait to have all of this settled first.
Okay.
Because then you'll be delayed
Do
by
it
that process.
simultaneously.
So your thought is to send that over to the Finance Committee?
And I would make that referral at a formal referral at a committee of the whole meeting.
Can we put that on for Monday? To refer?
Yes.
So while we're together, is there anything that anyone would like to bring up?
Did you want to give an update about the request
Okay.
to, or did you want to do that?
Should I, after the committee of the whole meeting, I reached out to Director Zamf. The Western Reserve Land Conservancy shared that they have surveyors going out across the city, and I reached out asking if there might be a possibility for the members of the housing committee to tag along with some of the surveyors to, see firsthand the work that's being done. Director Zamf said that that should be okay and left it to Mr. Butler to try to work through the details.
Yeah, and I think that's feasible to do. They typically start at around 8:30. So I would just suggest, once you make that announcement that that's possible, let's pick a date that looks like weather pending,
Okay.
right, that it's good, and give me a couple days heads up, and we'll let you know where they are, and you can meet them out on the street that they're working on.
Yeah, my thought was even if it's just for like 2 hours, it might be, nice for folks to, see firsthand that really awesome work that's being done and how helpful that could be to the city. So thank you very much, appreciate it. Okay, so with that, I will call this meeting to an end. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.